Morning. Welcome back to the third session of the long reach and cataclysm of World War I. If you've been to the two previous classes, you will be equally delighted and for the third class. This class is called Catastrophes Within Catastrophes, and it covers the years from 1916 to 1918. So please welcome with me our presenter today, Fred Johnson.
Good morning, scholars of the Hope Association of Senior Professionals. This is a great way to start my day. Truly it is. So thank you for signing on. Let's go ahead and get started. Like Kit pointed out, we're covering the years from 1916 to 1918. As I have discovered throughout my entire life studying history, there's always more information. There's always more information, and there's always the opportunity to find more. So I'll get through as much as I can today, but if you consider the title of the overall title of this course, The Long Reach and Cataclysm of World War I wanted to do it this way because World War I continues to bear down upon us. The legacy of it is still playing out right now as I speak to you. And let me go ahead and share my screen with you all. The subtitle for this particular session, just bear with me as I read, Unrestricted Submarine Warfare, the Genocide of Non-Combatants, and the Mobilized Ferocity of Modern Nations changed societies in every way imaginable, changing women's roles, the energized demands of domestic and international minorities for peace, and the strengthening and weakening of respectively new and old empires set the stage for a world that would never be the same. And we gotta move beyond just saying World War I set the stage and the foundation and parameters for World War II. That's very true that World War II, in many ways, was a direct outgrowth of the unfinished business of World War I. But World War I also set the stage and the parameters and the foundation for the Cold War and the ongoing international hostilities, or where you can find the cooperation that we have in the 21st century. So it just strikes me that it's very difficult to do politics domestically or internationally if you don't have a grasp of how World War I fundamentally changed humanity. Let me give a more immediate example or analogy that I'm sure people will be able to grasp. This pandemic that we're living through right now is changing everything about humanity. It's changed how we understand what it means to get together. It's changed how we communicate with each other. It's changed the meaning of education. Education will never go back to what it was in February 2020. When Hope College sent the students home for spring break in March, since then, education has been going through a revolution. So take those fundamental features of a society in the institutions and the people in those institutions and change the very nature of how they understand what it means to get together, have fun, go to baseball games, whatever they're doing. World War I had that kind of long reach. And as indicated here, there were catastrophes within catastrophes. We went a little faster last time, and I think I didn't mention this to you all, but let's go back to the year 1914 for just a moment. By December 1914, the Western Front in Europe stabilizes, and the aftermath of the First Battle of Ypres, as the Germans go on the offensive and transfer troops to the east to fight the Russians. There was a 450-mile-long Western Front that stretched from the Channel coast southward through Belgium and eastern France into Switzerland. Troops from both sides constructed opposing trench fortifications and dugouts protected by barbed wire, machine gun nests, snipers, and mortars, with an in-between area called no man's land. Mm. The Eastern Front also saw a share of trenches as troops dug in after the Russians held off the Germans in Poland and the Austrians held off the Russians at Limanowa. The 600-mile Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic Sea southward through East Prussia and Austria to the Carpathian Mountains. But in addition to all the tactical, strategic realities of what was happening by December 1914. Now, let me emphasize this. The war starts in August 1914. September, October, November, December. 4 months later, a mere 4 months later, the people in Europe, many of whom's nations had sent their troops off, marching off to combat, marching off to war, still thinking about the last war in 1870-71. They marched off to bands and flowers being thrown at the troops, hugs and kisses to young women, all kinds of things going on. They thought it was going to be a great adventure. By December 1914, the war had shown them there was no room left to swallow any more lies about the nature of what they had gotten themselves into. This battle map shows basically the strategic and battle lines from 1914 forward. But by December 1914, because there was a grim understanding settling upon people of the reality of what they got themselves into, and even more to the point, a reality of, as people speculated, now that we know what this thing is, or we're starting to get an idea what this thing is, there's no telling what's going to finally take to get us out of it. And to think about what it's going to take to finally achieve victory, what does victory even mean in a modern industrial war, especially the first one where you have no precedent. But by December 24th, 1914, something happened between German and French troops on Christmas Eve. I know a lot of you have heard about this, but I figured it would be appropriate to touch upon this anyway. It was called the Christmas Truce of 1914. And in this amazing moment, for this group of British and German soldiers who heard each other singing Silent Night, Holy Night from their respective trench lines, for that moment, the troops, in an act of democracy inside the military, something which those two words don't even fit together, they decided that for a moment, they would stop killing each other and celebrate Christmas. The English troops, just to make broad assumptions, the Anglican Church in England was still very strong. And in Germany, the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church, very strong. So people were not unchurched in either one of those countries. So the tradition of Christmas was very well established. Let's take a look at a quick video on what happened in that wonderful moment.
Check it. Open. Nine. Ein Britter kommt! Ein Britter kommt! Er ist nicht bewaffnet!
My name is Jim. Mein Name ist Otto. Pleased to meet you, Otto. Freut mich. Rose, she's calm. Schön. Schön. Danke. Christmas. Frohe Weihnachten.
One might say that that is a sentimentalized version of what actually happened, but I would submit to you that when you have spent 4 months trying to kill your fellow human being or being killed by them, is it really sentimental when people take pleasure in the fact that for 24 hours, they're not going to be killing each other? No one got permission from their respective high commands to stop the fighting. And on December 26, 1914, the German and British high commands respectively ordered their men to resume the killing. Back to the strategic map, back to the trench lines, back to the art and science of killing. And to help us understand what I mean about the long-reaching cataclysm of World War I, World War I, as World War II will do, forced humanity to redefine what it meant to be in war. World War I forced humanity to redefine what it meant to kill someone, because we understand that killing equals death, which means burial. But in different cultures at different times, people have handled life, death, and burial in different ways. And what World War I did was it took whatever life and death and burial had meant up to 1914, it completely reinterrogated that and forced people to think about those three things, which are fundamental to people's understanding of how you live. Forced them to revisit those and think of a new way for what war meant in the future. And the fighting in World War I think the pictures will speak for themselves. As you get into 1916, we find this letter from a British gunner, Frank Bracey, a final letter to his sweetheart. In recent years, British scholars, historians, archivists have been finding, just British citizens have been finding letters from their relatives, the men who fought in the trenches, back home to their sweethearts, in some cases, women who were on the front line serving as nurses. But let me just share with you this one from May 5th, 1916, from a British gunner, Frank Bracey. Dearest Win, I am writing just a line when, in case of accidents, just to let you know how I have always loved you. Dear, you are the best little girl on God's earth. Have I told you before? But I am writing this because I have a feeling that I shall not come back again. I have most of your letters in this box. Dearest, I wish. And there is this postcard with German written on it. Or that might be Dutch, I think it's German, but either way, you can see that the German soldiers were no less inclined to demonstrate their humanity either. Then there was this guy right here, Albert Leslie Cox. Albert Leslie Cox was 20 years old when he started writing to his sweetheart. Her name was Josephine Fien Hazeltine. Now the thing is, Josephine, from what I did in reading up on this, Josephine was only 14, 15 years old. And Albert Leslie Cox being 20 years old, that might have been a little bit of a stretch, but there's a thing about when nations go to war and young people are at war, life tends to speed up very fast for them. Suddenly, a death that's supposed to happen 5, 6, 7 decades into the future, now that it's staring them right in the face, there's a tendency to want to live life as fast as you can, as fully as you can. And so Fien and Leslie Cox established this connection and started writing each other. This one is from February 4th, 1916. My own dearest Leslie, Fien writes to him. I received your 2 letters yesterday, dated the 16th and 18th, and I was more than pleased to hear from you, also to hear you are still quite well. I am sorry that I made you feel so miserable when I said about something might happen, but I only felt a bit upset you are going back into the harried old trenches. But I have lost that feeling now. Thank God, I know he will spare you, so you must not think no more about it, will you? Well, dear Leslie, about your letter, Mom and Dad did not laugh. She said she felt sorry for you, as Dad was just the same. And a funny thing, she said that Dad wrote to her just as you have to me, as he was shy and asking Mom's mother. But dear Leslie, it is all right. Mom and Dad said you can have their consent. And Mom said, it lays between me and you now. So he was asking her, he had asked her to get married, but the further background on these two is that they eventually he ended up getting wounded, and he had said something to her about being in the aid station, and she had written letters to him telling him to do whatever he could to stay put in that aid station. But then she changed her mind and encouraged him. Decades later, in 2013, Leslie Cox's and Fiend's great-grandson, Stephen Pierman, found their letters in 2013 inside an old suitcase up in his loft and saw to his amazement that Leslie's letters were still splattered with trench mud. Their letters, which alongside photographs found next to them, numbered nearly 500 and have been compiled into a book by Mr. Pierman called Stay Safe, My Grenadier. Imagine going up to your attic and finding letters from World War I with a trench mud is still on them. Those letters and the pining hearts for sweethearts and the fear that is so evident in them, it just makes your heart pound harder for the danger, the terror, the horror that these young people were living with. And what they were living with shows up in the following images. World War I introduced the reality that whatever war is going to be like in the future, animals might still be used, but they weren't going to be used like they were in World War I. Animals were being quickly made obsolete by the war. Dogs, yes, maybe even carrier pigeons. World War I demonstrated that humanity had the power to destroy the landscape, to wound a living organism, the earth, in ways that people had never thought about before. Men living in water up to their knees and waist for days and weeks at a time introduced the problems of trench foot, waterborne diseases, cholera, dysentery. The big guns that tore up the earth and they caused so much harm. And let's emphasize those big guns for a minute. Those big guns, as I think I shared with you all last week, humanity had never, ever, ever, ever produced artillery weapons so large. And the artillery barrages, we talked about the creeping barrage last week, those artillery barrages that fell on human beings. Can we just agree that human flesh going up against an artillery round generally loses that battle? And those artillery barrages did things as far as wounding and maiming people that had been seen before, but never on that scale. Just as in Vietnam, we'll find a way of saving people's lives with medevacs and things that we use in medicine today. World War I introduced some realities that were undertaken to save people's lives that were eventually incorporated into domestic medical procedures, but in 1914 had never been seen before. What I mean is that, as we have said, war has always been a terrible thing, no matter when it happens. But each successive venture into warfare, humanity has, and I'll borrow the phrase from one of my students, humanity has taken the inherent horror of war and then invented new horrors to compound that which was already horrible. Wounds, never seen before, caused by weapons, never invented before. or wounds that had been seen before, caused by weapons never invented before, that made those old wounds be damaging in new ways. But all of that conflict, the weapons were bad enough. The battles were big and they were miserable. But what was going on in World War I suggested a warning for the future, because inside of World War I, there were catastrophes inside of catastrophes, obviously for the soldiers, obviously for nations, but obviously for how the world was going to try and find a way of getting along with itself if it could in the future. Let's take a look, first of all, at what had been the age of imperialism. Prior to World War I, nations like Great Britain, France, Germany, even the United States had all been on a great big momentous shift or venture to seize colonies. And in the case of Great Britain and France and Germany, this is a picture of Great Britain, a political cartoon. You can see that the British diplomat there has got his hands in Malta, Egypt, Canada, India, Jamaica, the Cape Colony, Gibraltar, Boers Land or South Africa, the British octopus. And no continent stands out to talk about, to exemplify the rapaciousness, the greed, and the conquering zeal of colonialism and imperialism like the continent of Africa. This map of Africa 1880 gives us an idea, first of all, of how big the continent is. But then if you take a look at Africa by 1914, the continent is completely subdued by European nations, Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and the very only two independent nations, Liberia and Ethiopia. Many people of the age saw it as the duty of Western nations to go and uplift their, what they would call the benighted peoples of the earth. If you wanted to get rude about it, the heathens or the non-Christian people, it should come as no surprise to us that those who were interested in getting resources and wealth and influence and colonies often invented reasons for doing so, or used the Bible as a justification for how they could go and spread God's word to other people who presumably didn't have any civilization, history, or values worth preserving. And so in this instance, you see, for example, a picture that pertains to the man named Cecil Rhodes. Now, Cecil Rhodes was called probably the greatest colonizer in Africa who ever lived. The nation Rhodesia would be named after him. Cecil Rhodes was indeed a very formidable individual. And this picture right here, I mean, this pretty much sums it up. This picture is taken of the Ashanti royal king and queen who are forced to pay homage to the British in what eventually becomes a nation in West Africa, but this shows British dominance. During World War I, the colonies owned by the British and the French and the Germans, those colonies would send colonial soldiers. In this case, you see Indian soldiers serving in France, who were known for their fighting spirit. British Senegalese soldiers. So now we're talking India and West Africa, meaning, of course, Senegal, French Moroccan division, Nepalese Gurkha soldiers. What would happen was that those soldiers would come from the African continent and from Nepal and elsewhere, as I mentioned, but don't hold up, just hold on there. When it came to China and Asia had also been the target of European or international imperialism. As you can see from this political cartoon, there's the Chinese dragon laying there either asleep or dead in the center, and fighting over it is the British lion, the Russian bear, the Austrian vulture, the Japanese are in there, the Americans are looking on from behind the Russian bear. But China also was a place that was exploited on a large degree. You can see here from this political cartoon that you have the Queen of England, the Kaiser of Germany, and other people, even the Japanese, who are carving up China for their own benefit, of course. And then there was the United States. The United States even had gotten involved in the colonization business. And by 1900, America had a Pacific empire that included Alaska, the Hawaiian Islands, Midway, Wake, Guam, and the Philippines. This kind of cartoon was very, very commonplace after the Spanish-American War, where Americans who had been the expansionists in America, because I don't want to give the wrong impression, not everybody was for colonization. In fact, there was a very vocal anti-expansionist group in America that included Mark Twain, who thought it was a very bad idea. Now, two things. They thought it was a bad idea on the one hand, because they didn't think it was right to go around conquering other people. And the other part was there were those who were opposed to expansion into these other territories because they didn't think that inviting people into the American sphere, into the American orbit, no matter if they were controlled or territories or not, they didn't think those people were developed enough, civilized enough to even be associated with America. And in a strange way, that resistance sort of explained why some people wanted to conquer them in the first place. Either way, this cartoon suggests that Uncle Sam is treating Hawaii, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba like unruly children. After World War I, several decades into the future, it'll be time to pay the bill and all that colonial activity. First, in the case of the United States, that expansion into the Pacific occurred and resulted in a conundrum developing because another nation, Japan, was also expanding. The eventual competition between the United States and Japan will produce some tragic consequences that will all be too crystal clear and evident on December 7th, 1941. Second, in the case of Africa, all that colonial activity, the European nations that dominate Africa from 1885 up until the 1940s, up to the 1960s, what's going to happen is that colonial troops will fight in World War I. They will also fight in World War II. Now, one major feature of colonialism was the racism and the oppression and the exploitation of peoples. Some people have called colonization akin to slavery, and depending upon the colonizer, it sort of was, especially if the colonizer was Belgium. But the point is, after the First World War and the Second World War, the people, a good number of the people who, colonial troops who go from Africa literally to Europe to fight in Europe during World Wars I and II, at the end of World War I, at the end of World War II, they're going to recognize that the European colonizers, France and England in particular, no longer have the economic or military strength, depth, endurance to hold on to their colonies. So in the 1950s and 1960s, as this map indicates, the bill coming due for the colonizers is that these African nations are going to be declaring independence in a rapid succession from the 1950s into the 1960s, and in the case of Angola, up to the mid-1970s. Eventually, Africa is going to become the strategic competition ground between the Soviet bear on the left and the American eagle on the right. And third, in the case of China, some Asian nations will refer to China as the sick man of Asia. Chinese nationalism and the vision of a man named Mao Zedong, who will want all foreign elements out of China, off the mainland. And it's going to result in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek, who's allied with the West during World War II, being kicked off the mainland, and the communists, and you'll notice that Mao Zedong is born in 1893. So by the time World War I comes along, he's 21 years old. He's a young man, but he's still in his formative stages. And that war is going to also shape his understanding of not just where China ought to be in the world, but when you overlay that with his Marxist ideals or his Marxist beliefs, that foreign involvement, that foreign exploitation, and that foreign domination of China is going to make Mao and his regime, is going to texturize it for what happens in the future when he finally takes over that country. And for a time, as indicated by this map, you see the Sino-Soviet alliance, when you have so much of the world dominated in the 19th to 20th century by communism. But in the meantime, while that was going on, the world, humanity was learning to fight a world war. That meant organizing masses of men and women, full mobilization of not just armies, not just governments, but entire societies, people who go into factories, schools, everything from different rivers, different institutions, all pouring into the same river for the enterprise or the venture of warfare. So you had to organize and collect mass quantities of material. Some of you probably remember your elders telling you about the rationing of World War II, the ration cards. And people had to ration materials in World War I as well. Aluminum becomes valuable. Nylon becomes valuable. The everyday things that we would throw away, suddenly you had to get those, and there are drives for them because the soldiers need them. Governmental centralization. World War I requires governments to assume more power for themselves, which calls into question constitutional limits and authority. But when the goal is to win, and no one can tell you what winning looks like, they can't tell you what it's going to take for the war to stop. At what point is achieving a victory in a battle, or at what point do you say, okay, we finally have achieved our objective? So governments will become more and more aggressive in suppressing civil liberties for the purpose of keeping populations motivated, stimulated, and otherwise conditioned to continue pursuing warfare until victory, whatever that is achieved. And then economic regimentation. The same way that governments will have to curtail or overlook civil liberties, also the economy will also be dedicated to waging war, making weapons for war, and financing the war. And then, of course, the manipulation of public opinion, propaganda. Because if you're going to wage full-scale modern warfare, you have to have a population that hates its enemy, which means then that the propaganda at some point is going to cross the line where the enemy starts being a human being who's an opponent and just somebody that must be vanquished at all costs. And conscription, drafting. When the Great War started in the summer of 1914, the military might of the European powers varied considerably. Britannia, Great Britain certainly ruled the waves and had a vast empire, but her army was small beer when compared with the land forces of her continental neighbors. The United States deployed another huge force to the Western Front in 1917. There was one simple reason for the disparity in the sizes of the armies: conscription. In other words, the British had not been drafting people into the army prior to 1914. Now the Germans had. Britain was alone amongst the European powers in not having a policy of calling up men for military service. The ranks of the French and German regular armies, already larger than Britain's, were routinely augmented by waves of draftees. Once these men had served their time, they joined the reserves. Germany and France were used to integrating and training raw recruits and could also call upon a large pool of reservists. So you have the standing army and then the reservists, which added to the growth of the armies into the hundreds of thousands, approaching and sometimes crossing into the millions. By the end of the battles of 1914, the battles of movement in the first weeks of the war had been brought to a halt. The fierce defense of strategic landmarks by the Allied forces resulted in a situation which became one of deadlock, carefully selecting the most favorable high ground to the Imperial German Army began the construction of a strong defensive line from early in 1915. And we saw last week how in 1915, Fritz Haber was the mastermind, if you want to call it that, behind the Battle of Ypres, where the Germans used gas for the first time in warfare. The consolidation of the front lines consisted of trenches, wire defenses, mined dugouts and deep bunkers, reinforced concrete emplacements, and selected strong points, usually a reinforced farm as an intermediate, second and third defensive line, or what in the military is called defense in depth. Gradually, the building and digging was carried on both sides of the wire along a distance of approximately 450 miles, creating a more or less continuous line of trenches separating the warring belligerents along the line of the Western Front. Bear with me a little bit more as I read this. In 1915, 16, 17, both sides made attempts to break the deadlock with major offensive. The characteristics of siege warfare, which developed in the Western Front in those 3 years, created conditions never witnessed before. Instead of expecting to achieve objectives at a considerable distance from the start of an offensive, the type of trench warfare created a situation where attacks were carried out in phases with short distance objectives and usually following a bombardment of enemy trench lines beforehand. So you have the situation where massive bombardments, short distance maneuvering, humanity under all that pounding, tearing the earth apart in the meantime. It was a strategy that led to prolonged periods of fighting with success counted in gains hundreds of yards rather than miles. So then there's the added effect that in addition to the terror and the horror and the destruction of warfare, there's the frustration of constantly marching in place. You're not making any kind of progress. So they settled into a stage of siege. One catastrophe that happened inside the catastrophe was in 1915 with the Armenian people. When I ran for Congress in 2008 and 2010, both times during those campaigns, I received letters. I cannot remember the name of the organization, but let me put it this way. It was an organization of American Armenians or Armenian Americans who wanted to know, basically in their material they sent me, they said, look, if we support you and you get elected to Congress, do you promise to introduce legislation that will bring Turkey to agree or admit that it was behind the Armenian genocide of 1915? And do you further promise or agree that if we support you, that you will also introduce legislation to make the Turks pay compensation, acknowledge, and then compensate for the lives lost of the Armenian genocide? Very much like the Japanese and the comfort women after World War II, the Japanese government for decades denied forcing Asian women into sexual slavery. Likewise, the Turks continue to brush aside responsibility for the Armenian genocide. And in 2008, 2010, when I got those letters from that organization, I was just, maybe I shouldn't have been, but I was kind of astonished that after all these years, they were still pursuing getting the Turks to admit to this and find some justice for these Armenian folks. At the turn of the 20th century, the once far-flung Ottoman Empire was crumbling at the edges, beset by revolts among Christian subjects to the north. Vast swaths of territory were lost in the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913, and the subject of coffeehouse grumbling among Arab nationalist intellectuals in Damascus and elsewhere. Emphasis on pay attention to the fact that in 1912, 1913, and at the start of the 20th century, you already have Arab nationalists. That's a foreshadowing of what will happen in the Middle East after World War II. This map shows the Ottoman Empire at its final stages in 1914. It wasn't going to take much to make the Ottoman Empire fall, and it did, and indeed before the end of World War I, it was gone. But the future nation of Turkey, which came to occupy that similar geographic space. On April 24th, 1915 through 1917, on the eve of World War I, there were 2 million Armenians in the declining Ottoman Empire. By 1922, there were fewer than 400,000. The roots of the genocide lay in the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Like the Austro-Hungarians had been looking to get rid of their ethnic problem, so the Ottoman rulers were looking to get rid of their Armenian Christian problem. The destruction of the Armenians was closely linked to the events of World War I. Fearing that invading enemy troops would induce Armenians to join them in the spring of 1915, the Ottoman government began deportation of Armenians from its northeastern border regions. So here we are in the opening decades of the 20th century, and we see one aspect of genocide is the removal of large numbers of people, deportation to areas not their homeland, not their traditional living areas. And of course, this process of deportation and ghettoizing people will be replicated in World War II during the final solution especially. The attempt by the Nazis to eliminate not just German Jews, but European Jews. The deportations expanded to almost all provinces regardless of distance from combat zones. So it didn't matter if the Armenians were close to the frontline area or where battles were being fought. The mere fact that there were Armenians in a front area or a rear area, it wasn't their proximity to the battle, their proximity to conflict, but the fact that there were Armenians. This is targeted. It's targeting people based on who they are, not what they've done or what they might do. The victims of the Armenian genocide include people killed in local massacres that began in spring 1915, others who died during deportations under conditions of starvation, dehydration, exposure, and disease. This gives us an idea of the nature of the warfare. I stop at a moment like this and ask my students sometime, okay, was this war too? Or was it something else? It happened during wartime, but seriously, was this also, do you also call this war? Maybe in 1870, 71, you don't. In 1915, you had to start thinking about, yes, this is also part of war. By 1945, sadly, it is too much associated with what humanity has now redefined warfare to be. This political cartoon speaks to all the promises that nations have made to themselves after the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, the Ukrainian Holodomor of the 1930s, what the Japanese did in Nanking in the 1930s, the Bosnian wars of the early 1990s, Rwanda 1994, Darfur and Sudan, Cambodian killing fields of the 1970s. I think it's probably safe to say that genocide has become a way of life for large conflict. Then there was this, another catastrophe in a catastrophe, shell shock. In the early years of World War I, shell shock was believed to be the result of physical injury to the nerves, like literally something shaking up or jangling the nerves. In other words, shell shock was supposedly the result of being buried alive or exposed to heavy bombardment. I submit to you that being buried alive in heavy bombardment, being exposed to heavy bombardment, that would have been bad enough. The term itself had been coined in 1917 by a medical officer named Charles Myers. But Dr. Myers rapidly became unhappy with the term, recognizing that many men suffered the symptoms of shell shock without having even been in the front lines. As a consequence, medical officers increasingly began emphasizing psychological factors as providing sufficient cause for breakdown. Look at that guy's eyes. You can tell that something is not right with him, something has happened to him. That odd smile, the eyes that are shining in that strange way. As the president of the British Psychoanalytic Association, Ernest Jones explained, war, especially the First World War, constituted an official abrogation, elimination, all bets are off. Constituted an official abrogation, that is, whatever used to be the rules before, the authorities are saying those rules no longer apply. An abrogation of civilized standards in which men were not only allowed, but encouraged to indulge in behavior of a kind that is throughout abhorrent to the civilized mind. So young men who have been taught all their lives, thou shalt not murder, or don't murder anybody. It's against the law. You'll do jail time. To be compassionate, to have empathy, all the things that we want people to exercise in a civilized way when civil society is functioning or trying to function as best it can. They're suddenly being told by the same authorities that would have jailed them before, no, now I want you to go out and not only kill, but kill enthusiastically. So they were encouraged to indulge in a behavior that was throughout abhorrent to the civilized mind. All sorts of previously forbidden and hidden impulses, cruel, sadistic. Son, when you're growing up, be kind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Show kindness to people. Be empathetic, be sympathetic. Help your neighbor out, help your friend out. Now they're being told, be cruel, be sadistic, murder, and so on. They were stirred together, stirred to greater activity, and the old intrapsychical conflicts, which according to Freud, we call that today cognitive dissonance. You spend an entire lifetime being told one thing, and now those authorities tell them, no, go do something different, and go do it with gusto and zeal and momentum. According to Freud, those intrapsychical conflicts are the essential cause of all neurotic disorders, in which had been dealt with before by the means of repression of one side of the conflict, are now reinforced, and the person was compelled to deal with them afresh under totally different circumstances. How is the mind and the emotions processing all this. When you have people that you're supposed to respect and look up to, your bosses are telling you to go kill people. Now, again, we understand that warfare is killing. That's why, of course, we should do war less than more. But now they're being told not just to go do it, but to go do it with enthusiasm, or at least with significant, murderous, constant intent. And then there's the other part, that the officials of the opposing army, is being told to do it to them too. So the fact that there people are trying to kill them is further incentive to ramp up their emotions and go do unto others before it happens to them. Symptoms range from uncontrollable diarrhea to unrelenting anxiety. Soldiers who have bayoneted men in the face developed hysterical tics of their own facial muscles. Stomach cramps seized men who knifed their foes in the abdomen. Snipers lost their sight. Terrifying nightmares of being unable to withdraw bayonets from the enemy's bodies persisted long after the slaughter. Sympathy was only rarely forthcoming. Sufferers had no choice but to acknowledge that their reputations as soldiers and men had been dealt a severe blow. So here's yet another catastrophe in the catastrophe. The fact that what it meant to be a soldier, what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be a human being had to be revisited and revised. If you go out killing with that kind of glee and gusto, can you retain your humanity? And if you do, that in itself is a problem. If you can kill people with no feeling, with no remorse. But if you kill people and you feel too much, if you have too much remorse, can you be an effective killer on the battlefield? What happens when it comes to forming friendships? What does that do to you if you survive and you return to the civilian world, where now all of a sudden the old rules are back in place, the old new rules are back in place, and you're being told to stop killing? Can you stop? If it becomes consistent, if killing becomes the new normal, what does that do to people going back into civil society? What does that do to their emotions? What does that do to their sense of belonging, their identity as human beings, or their identity as whatever they think they have become? After a major bombardment or particularly bloody attack, if the combatant had acquitted himself adequately, signs of emotional weakness could be overlooked. And then there's this part too, this whole manhood thing. What does it mean to be a coward? What does it mean to be brave? What does it mean just to hunker down and survive? The book Generals Die in Bed and All Quiet on the Western Front explore those issues. In Generals Die in Bed, you have a bunch of Canadian soldiers who are doing their duty. They're just trying to get through the day, get through the moment, get through the day, get through the week. Are they cowards for just doing that? And All Quiet on the Western Front, these are 4 German soldiers. They're young boys. They're doing their duty too, but they're not out there trying to charge. They're not trying to gain glory, at least they're not anymore. Are they cowards? Are they just trying to survive? Are they doing their duty? Do they love their country? All these things come up as issues to be considered, dealt with, and responded to. And we have to redefine what patriotism was. And when you look on the faces of this guy who will be suffering for years afterward, it's a discussion that the world needed to have. Now, eventually what happened was that British doctors figured out that it was indeed psychological, and they started employing something called the talking cure. The talking cure, which today we call therapy. And of course, as we go further into when we get to World War II, shell shock will become called combat fatigue. And after Vietnam, into Korea, and after World War II, into Korea, and especially into Vietnam, we now know that term shell shock, which became combat fatigue, will be upgraded to post-traumatic stress disorder. People that have been through a horrific event that cannot be fully explained emotionally, but afterward, after the trauma, they still are responding emotionally and psychologically to the disorder of the not normal that they were forced to go through. This is one of the most compelling pictures that I've seen from all the pictures I've seen of World War I. The look on that man's face, his exhaustion, his misery speaks for itself. So shell shock, the bombardments did things to people's gait, their walk, the ticks in their eyes, all kinds of odd things. Let me share this with you all. I wasn't going to do this, but I think it's worth taking a look at.
Training.
During the First World War, a new condition emerged that caught the military and medical establishment completely off guard. There was no telling who would be affected by it or why. Those who suffered from it might be hypnotized or electrocuted, arrested or shot, all for the same illness. So many men were lost to it, there would be a revolution in military attitudes and a new field of medicine created. The condition was called shell shock.
These are the men whose minds the dead have ravished. Memory fingers in their hair of murders. Multitudinous murders they once witnessed.
The war on the Western Front was different from any war fought before. New machines dominated the fighting. Modern factories produced gas and high explosives, used for the first time on an industrial scale. Sustained shelling caused horrific injuries and dismemberment, testing the endurance of Britain's soldiers.
You were living in a land of impossibility, death, blood, mud, pouring with rain, boiled with sun. You could have run away for miles. And if I hadn't have had a command, I think I should have run away. I think I couldn't have stuck it.
No one, from new recruits to experienced officers, was prepared for trench warfare. Traditional ideas of courage and cowardice were slowly eroded as the misery of the conflict took its toll.
Traditional ideas of cowardice and courage had to be redefined. And as that short video clip pointed out, those large guns, especially that last gun you all saw fire, tremendously large weapons. I mentioned to you that the Germans designed an artillery piece that could fire around from the continent across the channel into England. So amazingly sophisticated, incredibly powerful engines of destruction. And as it also pointed out, those amazingly complicated, incredible engines and guns of destruction, they took a terrible toll on human lives and bodies. Which is why I thought it would be appropriate to speak for a little while on the person that I refer to as the Angel of Faces. Her name was Anna Coleman Ladd. Anna Coleman Ladd. Because of the new ways of killing people and waging war, because those artillery weapons were so destructive, because they did things to men and women that had been seen before, but not in this particular way, particularly when it came to facial injuries. The facial injuries that soldiers suffered during World War I were a direct result of the destructive power and intentionality of the weapons that were being used to wage war And Anna Coleman Ladd did something wonderful for these soldiers, whose faces in many cases were blown off like this guy. How is this individual, if he went back to civilian life, how is he supposed to go back to civilian life and live anything that might be called or that he might consider to be a normal life? When you look at his face and the medals on his chest, those medals are so worthless or can't do anything to restore what he's lost in his face. Anna Coleman Ladd was in the business of restoring those faces. This is a French soldier who was wounded horribly that she helped. She was from the United States. She heard about a sculptor who was doing some work in Europe. And as a sculptor herself, she decided to go to Europe and lend her talents. This is the French soldier on the left. Look at how his face has been mangled. And then what she made was a mask for him on the right. There's some other before and after pictures of other soldiers. This guy has his nose blown out. She gave these men back their dignity, their lives, and a second chance. Let's take a look at Anna Coleman Ladd.
At first, these World War I era photos look unextraordinary. Medals, jackets with large buttons, some bandages. But look at the glasses. None of them are for vision. They were for support. Through this passageway and inside a studio, sculptors created the best possible way to conceal some of the war's most significant facial injuries. World War I is known for machine guns, tanks, and lethal gas attacks, but artillery dominated attacks on trenches. When you think of artillery, imagine cannons, guns that fired large, destructive shells. This chart shows estimates of artillery rounds in battles from the American Civil War to World War I. At Gettysburg, 32,000 rounds were fired. At some, in 1916, 4 million. A staggering volume of shells dropped, creating deadly flying debris. That barrage resulted in an estimated 20,000 facial injuries, a statistic that medicine had to confront. This book about plastic surgery was published after the war, but it shows groundbreaking techniques for suturing and transplanting skin. Techniques like cartilage insertion in the nose or grafts to the ear were pioneering at the time. But some cases went beyond the abilities of these plastic surgeons. That's where the sculptors came in. Before she was in this American Red Cross studio in Paris, Anna Coleman Ladd was a sculptor and writer in America. Having heard of the sculptor Francis Derwent Wood's pioneering work in London, in 1917, she took his techniques to the Red Cross in France, starting her own studio there. They made casts of the injured faces, then sculpted attachments that restored the face. These were then used to make a paper-thin copper-plated attachment, which Ladd and others then painted. Eyebrows and mustaches were made from real hair or tiny pieces of tinfoil, with astonishing results. They were supported by tiny ties around the ears, or, more often, glasses. They made more than 150 of these masks. After the war, Anna Coleman Ladd returned to America. She sculpted many pieces similar to her pre-war work. Perfect figures, oblivious to charts about artillery. Figures who didn't need glasses. In 1923, she created a controversial World War I memorial for the American Legion in Manchester, Massachusetts. It showed a skeleton trapped in barbed wire. She once wrote about memorials: when the masters of yesterday have passed, the masters of tomorrow will express this new sense of the futility of war and the greater power of the spirit. Her memorial in Manchester actually had two images. The skeleton was called Night. On the other side, she put Dawn.
Writing's not that easy, but
very similar to what would be the case in World War II, when Winston Churchill was doing his best to get American aid during the Battle of Britain. People in Europe by 1915, 1916 were wondering, would the United States get involved? But the United States had really no reason to get involved unless you consider this particular weapon: submarines, the sharks of the sea. The Germans eventually will adopt a strategy at sea called unrestricted submarine warfare, which is another catastrophe that happened within the catastrophe of World War I. Now, submarines, or the idea for them, were not new. Many people know about the Hunley, which was a submarine that was built by the Confederacy that had, well, not very much success, but the idea, the fact that he tried to deploy it, shows that the idea of attacking ships from beneath the waves was not brand new. But in the World War I, the idea took on a new meaning, because now humanity had the ability to not only build such ships, but build them and deploy them with success. So again, bear with me as I read. There were a few reasons why Germany made the decision to increase the amount of U-boat warfare and the level of aggressiveness the submarines were to employ. Germany was seeking to conquer Britain, and a large amount of supplies were being shipped to the nation via freighter and tanker routes. A good amount of those supplies were coming from the United States. So the Germans, understandably and logically, conclude that cutting off the amount of supplies would hamper Britain's war efforts, and they were not wrong. For the same reason that in World War II, during the Battle of the Atlantic, the Germans will deploy submarines in groups called wolf packs, for the same reason that the British will fear the German battleship, the Bismarck and the Graf Spee, for the same reason that the Luftwaffe will try to bomb the British into submission, and knowing that they're cut off and becoming more and more desperate and their money's running out and their supplies are running out, all those things in some way apply also in World War I. Britain is an island nation with a smaller population and a limited economy, and it could not hold out indefinitely. So just like the Americans found out toward the end of the Civil War, that the one way of finally breaking the spine of the Southern will to resist was to not only defeat the Southern Confederate armies on the battlefield, but to eliminate those sources that made it possible for them to deploy to the field of battle in the first place. And that means factories, farms, food, civilians, transportation networks, all the stuff that you wouldn't immediately associate with war. So the Germans figured out that if they cut off supply lines, if they cut off food, if they stop gas, fuel shipments, anything coming from allies, formally declared or otherwise, that will be an advantage to them. And they use submarines to do it. Surfacing left these subs open to attack by the very formidable Royal Navy. Now, I must say that in World War I, submarines are dangerous, but they're not very good. They're not able to stay up underwater very long. And when a submarine goes into the attack, it was not at all unusual for a submarine to surface and to make sure that when they fired their torpedoes, they would get an accurate hit. They would surface and shoot the torpedo while surface. And then once they're assured that it's either going to hit, once they saw the explosion, then go back beneath the waves. But most importantly, there was a terrorism component to the attacks. Again, we have to consider, when I say a cataclysm within a cataclysm, that World War I forced humanity because of genocide, forced humanity because of the horrific wounds to the face and other parts of the bodies with these creeping bombardments, because of the mobilization of populations and economies and governments and propaganda. World War I also introduces the necessity to understand what is it to mean fairness in war or conventional war. Because for the first time now, human beings, in addition to having to redefine what courage is or cowardice is relative to issues of shell shock, now you're dealing with a weapon that literally sneaks up on you, pops up above the water, fires, and then goes back beneath the waves. Is that fair? Is that man-to-man fighting? Is that treating your opponent with the kind of honor and courage that you might have expected in 1870, 71? Or is that expectation as obsolete as cavalry charges? And it turns out that the expectation of observing the rules of war, 19th century style, had no place in World War I. By 1917, Germany was not succeeding well with its military objectives. On the Western Front, it was losing ground badly. And there was definitive fear in 1917 by the Germans that if America entered the war, that defeat was unavoidable. So prior to that, the Germans got desperate. And that brings us to the Canard liner RMS Lusitania. After secret Whitehall misgivings about the official account of one of the most controversial and tragic episodes of the First World War were revealed in newly released government documents, almost 70 years after the Canard line RMS Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland, some officials expressed concern that the truth was still being covered up. The RMS Lusitania sailed from New York on 1 May 1915, which was her last voyage. The liner was sunk off Southern Ireland on 7 May. On May 7th, the Lusitania neared the coast of Ireland. At 2:10 in the afternoon, a torpedo fired by the German submarine U-boat U-20 slammed into her side. A mysterious second explosion ripped the liner apart. This is the source of the continuing controversy, because the Germans were alleging on many occasions that these ships, these civilian ships that were just carrying passengers, had no armaments, no munitions. Well, the secondary explosion led them and others to believe that they may have been carrying civilians, but they were also carrying munitions headed for the British. Chaos reigned after that second explosion. The ship listed so badly and quickly that lifeboats crashed into passengers crowded on the deck or dumped their loads into the water. Most passengers never had a chance. Within 18 minutes, the giant ship slipped beneath the sea. 1,119 of the 1,924 aboard died. The dead included 114 Americans. This, of course, resulted in a response of protest from the US government, particularly President Woodrow Wilson. I won't share what Wilson wrote because I want to spend some time for us to get, or have us some time to get into some Q&A. But this incident right here with the Lusitania and other ships that had been attacked before the Lusitania, this is what began to harden American attitudes about whether or not to get into World War I. In a nutshell, Wilson and American diplomats would claim that America was a neutral country and that the Germans, a belligerent, were attacking a neutral nation's merchant ships. The Germans, of course, had a different idea. They saw America giving comfort, aid, and material capability to its enemy. Now, the Americans were not the only ones that, let me say this, the Germans were not the only ones that the Americans had some hostility with. Great Britain also was a problem for America when it came to its claiming neutral status. The British, for their part, mined the North Sea, which Wilson also protested about. So in communiques to both Berlin and London, America, a maritime nation, was claiming the rights of oceanic or transoceanic neutrality, claiming that to two combatants involved in the most vicious war in humanity up to that point, and claiming that while somehow figuring or expecting that those two belligerents would overlook America as they fought each other. And by 1915, 1916 into 1917, by 1917, there was no doubt that the war had reached a level of ferocity and destruction and inhumanity never seen by the species before. So for Woodrow Wilson to be claiming rights of neutrality, in some cases he made a claim going back to treaties that had been signed in 1798 during the administration of John Adams. The British and the Germans just weren't having it. And so the British did not endear themselves to the Americans because of their stance, and the Germans definitely made the American president and the American people all the more irate. Until when you finally get to April 1917, when the president goes before the Congress and asks for a declaration of war. If there was anything, there are many more things I'm going to get into, but if there's anything that drove the American nation to feel like it had no choice, or those who felt this way, like they had to get involved in World War I, it was from the beginning, the horrific stories coming out of Belgium about what the Germans had been doing to the Belgian people, and just the utter cruelty. Then the other stories about the atrocities on the Western Front. There was also, of course, the meltdown that was going to eventually be happening in the Soviet Union, or rather Russia, that becomes the Soviet Union, but that'll happen in November 1917. That's going to be several months after America gets involved in World War I. But it was this issue of unrestricted submarine warfare and the violation of America's neutral rights as an independent sovereign nation that was the driving force that led American policymakers to decide once and for all that they had to get involved in World War I on the side of the Allies. But that still will be in the future. Newspapers carried the headline about the Lusitania, of course. But at the end of the day, up until America gets involved in the war, people wondered, okay, what now? What was the United States going to do? And once America declares war on Germany in April 1917, it will change the fortunes for the Allies. It's going to enter the whole world, the United States that war, entry into that war, is what moves America from being a significant power to a great power and eventually a superpower. It is America's true moment of stepping out onto the world stage. And as World War I reshapes the political geography in Europe, particularly with the Treaty of Versailles, and then the Bolshevik Revolution that happens later in 1917. And then the other thing that happens in 1917, 1918, but definitely in 1918, when the world is seized not only by the destruction of World War I, the human destruction of World War I, but the pandemic of the 1918 Spanish flu. I'm going to get deep into the Spanish flu next week. I wanted to make sure we hit these other subjects today so we can understand the catastrophes within the catastrophes that not only were part of World War I, but how World War I was that launch point that set the world on a trajectory that in the case of communist China, Soviet Russia, America becoming a superpower, colonization ending in Africa, and so many other things, the redefinition of warfare, the creation of the talking therapy, all these things that human beings had to adjust to in order for the 20th century to become what it was. And World War I was the entree point into that. Through a doorway of violence, humanity entered into a more common ground that became the norm for the 20th century. And we'll start next week by talking about America's entry into World War I and the subsequent difficulties imposed not just on the battlefield, but how the nation and the world responded to the global pandemic of the 1918 Spanish flu. I will take your questions now.
Okay, Fred, I have a couple of comments and questions. So the first one sounds like you're going to address next week, but it was just, did the pandemic of 1918 prevent the Germans from mounting a last fierce offense? And how did the Spanish flu affect World War I? So sounds like you're going to address that next week.
I am.
There's another comment just regarding a new book called Manipulating the Masses, Woodrow Wilson and the Birth of American Propaganda by John Maxwell Hamilton of LSU. Just letting people know. And then I heard that a governmental propaganda committee was started by Woodrow Wilson during World War I. It still exists and money is spent on this effort, probably much more. Can Fred comment on this and its effectiveness?
It was very effective. First of all, I hadn't heard of that particular feature, but I'm not surprised that it was created. And was it effective? Yes, it was. Because when you see the enthusiasm with which Americans respond to going to World War I and the buy bonds campaign to finance the war, that's the thing about every war. And of course, we'll see this in World War II. But buying bonds, basically taking out IOUs from the US government, giving them their money, they give you an IOU so they can use that money to buy troops, so they can buy uniforms, start expanding industries to build armaments and so forth. It was a very successful campaign. The British and the Germans, of course, no surprise, they had their own propaganda campaigns. I think I shared with you all some of the posters last week. And, when you look at some of those posters, it should seem to 21st century eyes, 21st century sensibilities, that they are so ham-fisted, so over the top in their messaging. But on the other hand, they were simple, they caught people's attention, they appealed to the emotions, and most of all, they worked. They worked. America went to war, and America dedicated itself to the war, and America helped win the war. So if results are any indication of how successful that part was, yeah, it worked.
Okay. Then there's also a comment, another House member had a family member who has visited the World War I Museum in, I guess, Kansas City, and highly recommends it.
Yeah. If anybody has a chance to, when we're allowed to travel overseas again, if anybody has a chance to visit the British Imperial War Museum, that is worth the visit because they have a World War I trench warfare display that is out of this world. You walk in there, and for a moment, you have to remind yourself that you're not back in 1916.
Okay. Question, will you discuss next week the loss of Christian faith and the near death of the church in Europe and the UK as a result of World War I?
Yes, I can give a comment on that right now. After World War I, there was this movement that arose called the Dada movement or Dadaism, and it was a direct reaction to the catastrophic, the incomprehensible loss of life in World War I. The Europeans had this moment which lasted it was a long moment, a 4-year long moment, like the Battle of Antietam on September 17th through 19th, 1862. At Antietam in Western Maryland, the loss of life there in that battle in 2 days that numbered in the double-digit thousands caught the Northern government and Northern populace and Southerners by such shock and surprise. Because, of course, if you fight wars for years, you expect to lose a lot of people over the course of years. But in a 2-day battle, the loss of life was so high, they had to even rethink what it meant now to fight the rest of the Civil War. Essentially, if this war goes on for any length of time and every battle like this, and every battle we fought is like this one or worse, this is going to be a long, terrible, miserable thing. And as it turned out, the Civil War was a long, terrible, miserable thing. So when you look at the loss of life in World War I, which exceeded by far the loss of life in the Civil War, people began to have this existential crisis where they ask a very simple question that I think many people, countries, or individuals do quite often. If there's a loving God who is all powerful and all sovereign and all grace and all mercy, how does the destruction I see across this land, these bloated animals and these stinking bodies, how does that loving God, how does all that understanding that I've been taught translate into this? And for a moment, people can't put the two together, and Christianity begins losing its foothold as a force in Europe. Let me be very careful. That is not to say Christianity goes away in Europe, because obviously it does not. But it's very difficult. The practice of the numbers of people who are cleaving to Christianity begins to shift into some negative numbers because of the existential crisis. People just can't put it together. And so the Dada movement actively discourages that kind of belief. And if anything, it embraces the futility of human life, wondering what's it all for anyway, because it's very nihilistic.
Okay. Then there's a question about if you could comment regarding Germany's approach to Mexico to join them.
Yes, I'll talk about that next week. I think that was hitting at the Zimmerman telegram. The Germans sent a telegram to the Mexican government asking that the Mexicans, basically promising them that if, and actually it wasn't all that much of an outlandish idea. Hey, Mexico, if you come in on our side and when we win this war, we'll help you get back that land that the Americans stole from you back in 1846. Now, if you're a Mexican nationalist, that sounds like a good idea. But, you know, even the Mexicans have eyes and ears and can sit up there and take their finger to the wind and figure out which way the wind is blowing. And by 1917, when the German, it's called the Zimmerman telegram, when the Germans make that appeal to the Mexican government, the Germans are not at their best. There's still a lot of question marks.
Okay. The last thing I have is kind of a personal question, so don't feel like you have to answer it.
Okay.
Just says, please ask if Fred agreed to the Armenian Americans' demand for going after Turkey.
Yes, I did.
Okay.
At both campaigns, because I first off, as an historian, there's more than enough historical evidence to say that the Armenian genocide did occur. Second, just as a matter of genocidal justice, yes. And two, in 2008 and 2010, I don't know, I have to go back and look and see when Recep Tayyip Erdogan actually became the president or the leader of Turkey. But we were already having some difficulties. In 2008, you know, this is long before ISIS and the Islamic State. I was already suspecting in 2008 that the relationship between the United States and Turkey was shifting in a not good direction. And indeed, in 2011, when the Arab Spring started in Tunisia and then moved east into Libya, and then eventually back west to Algeria, then Egypt, and then Syria, the destabilization in Syria that led to the refugee crisis through Turkey is what has, in many cases, hardened the already hard autocratic stance of the Erdogan government that led them to become even more threatening to the Kurds, who are our allies in Iraq. So I was thinking about the future and how the relationship with Turkey was going to probably be diminished anyway, not because of anything we were doing, but because of their current leadership. And a lot of that has been borne out. I don't mean to make myself sound prescient. I was just connecting the dots on a strategic landscape that I saw developing.
Great, thank you. That's all I have. If anyone wants to unmute themselves for another question or comment, we have just a couple minutes left.
Fred, your pictures of the disfigurement and your emphasis on the efforts to use masks to help them was so interesting to me and an amazing part of World War I. It occurs to me that those types of wounds would have been less common in the Civil War or wouldn't have been survived, right? Like they would be blast wounds or more burn wounds that we were looking at there, where the man comes back and nobody can tell him to snap out of it.
No, and your point and your observation is spot on, Linda. And not only because, no, this is not to say that facial wounds and amputations didn't occur during the Civil War. Clearly they did, but that's why I kept on making the linkage between the wound and the weapon that caused the wound.
Yeah,
weapons that were being used in World War I were, compared to the Civil War, were of such an amazingly destructive nature and capability that if you were wounded, think about the conflict we're in today. In Iraq and Afghanistan, you hear the term IED, improvised explosive device. So those weapons have been designed, and their deployment is such that the nature of the weapon, in many cases, not illogically, has a direct impact upon the nature and severity of the wound. So those big guns designed to maim, kill, destroy, and blow apart, if they tore your face off, well, that's what they were designed to do. And likewise, the other point, something else you said that maybe that triggered a thought, we need to also remember that when those men who are wounded are losing their faces and they're walking around, even with the wonderful work that Anna Coleman Ladd did, she was such an amazing woman. Even with the work that she did in restoring these men and giving them a second lease on, we have to remember that those men, if they survive the war, they'll be walking around in 1920, 1928, 1932, 1935. So as World War II starts gathering, those men will be living reminders about why we shouldn't do world wars. And that's what will lead many people, they are living reminders of the cost of modern global warfare. So the people who are afraid of doing another world war, they have ample reason, practical reason, pragmatic reasons to keep the peace as long as they can. And of course they try until they simply can't, because Adolf Hitler is just that kind of a bully, thug, and a murderer.
I just wanted to.
Yes?
I wanted to make a comment about the memorial in Vimy.
Yes.
For World War I. My sister, I've never been there, but my sister has been there, and she said at 8 o'clock every night, they have this large crowd that gathers for the flag lowering, and it's gone on every single night except during World War II, and it gathers a huge crowd of people, which shows the impact of World War I to this day.
That's right. That's right. And when you look at, of course, World War I and the severity of it, it is no surprise that the severity of what happened on the battlefield during World War I, it texturized the peace negotiations that happened afterward. It may be useful to every now and then poke criticisms at George Clemenceau, the Tiger, and Woodrow Wilson, who went to the Conference of Versailles. But these individuals, as a generation, an entire generation, have been traumatized. They all went through the same thing together. And that thing that they went through together was 4 years of horror. And the resentment, the anger, the frustration, the rage of what had been unleashed. And like human beings are wont to do, like we did in the Great Recession, and like they did in the Great Depression, when things go wrong in our lives, we ask two questions. What happened? Why did it happen? And if we can, who's responsible? Likewise, once they figured out what had happened, and then it took some time just to digest what had happened. I mean, all these decades later, we're still trying to answer what happened during World War I. Why did it happen? Okay, they provided themselves some answers, but it was that last question. And who was responsible? That's the one where that rage, that anger, that frustration, they started directing that in different ways. There were memorializations as you're discussing, but in the answer to those questions, again, it set the trajectory and the foundation for what eventually happened a second time with the cataclysm of World War II.
Going to talk.
You, John?
A year ago, Shay and I were in Flanders, in Lille. We toured some of those battlefields where they still have remnants of the trenches and the bunkers.
Yeah.
And along the fence lines of these farms, farmers are still placing unexploded ordnance.
Yes.
A century ago, this is live ammunition that they find and they stack by their fence line, which is eventually picked up by the government and somehow disposed of. And occasionally, according to the people we talked to, a farmer's plow will hit the wrong shell.
That's
and
right.
there's one more casualty of the First World War.
So think about this, John. It's 100 years later. That gives you an idea. If you discount, ordnance that didn't fire during World War II, but if it's a World War I era or World War I vintage shell, that gives you an idea how it is more than 100 years later, and it's still there, which gives us an idea of just how much artillery was rained down upon Europe in those barrages, that it can still be there. Let me give you a more modern example, or more up-to-date example. In Angola and Cambodia, and especially Cambodia, last time I looked, they had two of the highest amputation rates and prosthetic rates in the world. A former student of mine actually, her follow-on major was to get into prosthetic science, because she wanted to go to Cambodia because they have all these unexploded shells from the Vietnam War, bombs and mines and cluster munitions, that when kids are playing or when farmers are farming, they blow up the water buffalo, children are injured. I mean, it's just terrible. And the war's been over now for more than a quarter century. So your story sounds very similar to that. So I'm not at all surprised when you look at, I read the statistics on the artillery barrages of World War I, some of these battles like Verdun, which lasted, I think, a year. And it was characterized by nothing but artillery barrages. So I can't even imagine, I remember being in the Marine Corps when I had an A6 intruder out in the desert in the 29 Palms fly over us at 0 altitude and drop 2 1,000-pound bombs, how the earth shook and rattled and whatnot. That I can still feel that right now. So I cannot even begin to imagine the impact when you are spending days and nights with a constant or very frequency of artillery that's just raining down upon you from some of the most big, powerful, destructive weapons ever created by human ingenuity. It must have been horrible.
Oh, I'm sure at the German cemetery, they had an area, because there's a very large cemetery, but they had an area slightly larger than a basketball court, which was just grass.
Yeah.
No markers. And there was a plaque next to it that said that this area contained the remains of 18,000 unidentified German soldiers. Incredible.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
18,000 of them.
So you guys visited cemeteries too? Because in some countries there was a lot of controversy about having, let's say, German soldiers buried in France. The French frankly didn't want to have that done, but they eventually got past that. But that is incredible. 18,000 soldiers unidentified in the size of a basketball court.
Yes.
Yeah.
They must have been stacked in there, God knows how deep.
Wow. Yeah, that's why, this is why I thought, I'm trying to find a way of helping myself help us understand the world we're living in. And this is where, of course, the questions about the pandemic are very relevant. And like I said, I promise to get to that next week. But when you look at how things are breaking down internationally right now, our foreign policy, there are lessons in World War I that we need to really pay attention to if we are going to, not so much another world war, but if America is going to retain its position and we're going to maintain international peace such as it is, we've got to look at the roots of the stuff that's going on right now. Even in 2011, the Arab Spring that started still has its origins in World War I.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Okay, everybody, it's 11:08. So we're gonna wrap up. And Kit, do you want to say anything about next week or anything else?
Let me just say that every time we end one of these sessions, it's a little bit of, I have separation anxiety. I miss you guys so much. So it requires a lot for me to say bye, but yeah, there we go.
I know, same.
Well, we all feel the same way. And I just want to have you remember that Fred's session Friday, or excuse me, next Wednesday will be the last session. We're just not going to tell you what the title is. It'll be a surprise. You already know what some of his topics are, but it'll be the final session of 4 sessions. And we appreciate Fred's work and his, I think it takes a lot of courage to work on this kind of material knowing that how really rough it is. So we all thank you very much for your research and your loving us. We like that very much too.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Fred.
Yes. Thanks. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Fred.
Take care.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.